one way to go from a structural analysis, that is basically a summary of the plot, to a close reading analysis would be to use a post-colonial historical lens to understand the hero's journey or the heroine's journey in Ashapelta. So, quick history check. Ireland is the first colony of Great Britain. They're a colony for over 800 years. So it's a very fraught colonial history, but at the very end of this history, in the 1840s, we have the Great Irish Potato Famine, which has often been called genocide by ecological disaster. So a water mold comes to Ireland, and this water mold destroys the potato crop. But the British colonial response, that is the government's response, this isn't just things that people said, this is things that were said in a government context, publicly and recorded, is things like, well, the famine's only going to kill about 1 million Irish, and that would hardly solve the Irish problem. That is a genocidal statement. Other statements like, well, we're going to be blamed if we save the Irish or if we let them die. So it's really just, do we want to be philosophical about this, or are we concerned about money? And Great Britain landed on the side of money. They did not aid Ireland during famine, and in fact continued to exact food taxes from the starving Irish. Ireland's population went from 8 million in the 1840s, the highest it had ever been, to 4 million after the famine. That means half of the Irish population either died or emigrated, and we don't know of those of the 3 million who at least left Ireland, we have no idea how many of those died along the way or died upon reaching their destinations because they had been so malnourished and were suffering from so many diseases because of that. So this genocide by ecological disaster is what became the catalyst for forming the first Irish political party that was fighting for Irish home rule. And even though that was they never succeeded in that, they never convinced a sort of partial separation from Great Britain. In a way, that movement for home rule culminated in the revolution that finally ended 800 years of colonial oppression in Ireland and resulted in the creation of an independent Irish state. Now, this war for independence was not an easy war. It began in 1916, which is the middle of World War I, and after several years, in 1920, when Ireland finally gets independence from Great Britain, there is then an ensuing civil war to figure out how this new government, this new Irish state, will be run. And so there's decades, at least a decade or more, of warfare for Ireland before peace is finally established and this new government gets off the ground. And so all of these things are the context for Sinead de Valera's specific literary version of this traditional folktale. So there's lots of versions of Harry Rucky in the Irish folklore collections that were made in the 1930s. So we know this is a very popular, very common tale. Sinead de Valera specifically got her version of the tale from her mother, who lived through the Irish potato famine, just like many of the storytellers would have in the ones that are in the 1930s collection. And so she's gathered this from her mother, who's lived through this famine, and she herself had been very active in the fight for independence. Her husband, who was imprisoned during this fight, becomes eventually the first president of Ireland. And it's in that time of peace, when he's president, that Sinead de Valera is rewriting and editing this as a story for children, because she's specifically interested in how do we help a generation that has known nothing but warfare. Children who were born during the war and who have grown up entirely surrounded by war in their home country. How do we help them heal? How do we help them understand a new kind of Ireland? And I think all of these things we could possibly see reflected in her story. So here is a way you could do a cultural reading with the hero's journey. First of all, the death experience, the early death experiences that we see Harry go through, I think could relate to the potato famine. She is tied to the land. First a rick or a haystack is put on her, right? Then she's buried in a potato field. And finally tied to a tree. All of these are aspects of the land, and she is physically bound to them. And they cling to her. They talk about it in her hair and on her body. She is perhaps even a representation of the land itself. A land that has gone through ecologic disaster as well as the brutal devastation of war. And I think the final half of the story, that first threat to her family, is a personal threat. The last threat is about establishing a kingdom, and it's important that it is a kingdom that Harry, Rucky, and her sisters choose to be a part of. Sort of the way people in Ireland had chosen to separate and are making this new nation, perhaps. But the king and his princes, they can't rule, or what they need to establish this rule is the magic that has been stolen from them. Perhaps a great metaphor for colonialism, stealing the right to rule, the right to self-governance, and the need to restore these things, and who restores them? Harry Rucky. That her final half of trials are trials about restoring rightful rule. And it's a rule by men, but it's a rule that only Harry Rucky, or Ashipelt, excuse me, can establish. So for the child reading this, is this about sort of owning and understanding a sense of ownership for this new government that the child has, or the child's family, who would have been involved one way or another in these conflicts, were a part of creating? That sort of reading is a cultural analysis based on the structural analysis of the hero's journey in Harry Rucky, and perhaps explains why a hero's journey, a female hero, is needed, because opposed to the sort of spiritual journey and connection with masculine and feminine that we see in the heroine cycle, this is about that typical hero structure, which is restoring the community in perhaps a nationalistic sense,